We are looking at the life of David on a Sunday night, and last week we looked at the tragic account of the rape of Tamar, David's daughter. Her half-brother Amnon trapped her into coming into his bedroom, he pretending to be ill, and then he pounced on her, and despite her cries and her warnings, he went on and did that wicked thing. His desire for her soon changed to hatred, and he threw her out. And her full brother Absalom found her and put her away. Absalom now was full of hatred for Amnon and was determined to murder him, no matter how long he had to wait for the opportunity. Meanwhile, the purposes of God were working out, and David was beginning to reap back what he'd sown in the matter of Uriah and Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan had warned him that the consequences of what he'd done would come back on him through his family. And this was now coming to pass. He'd been immoral with another man's wife, so now somebody had been immoral with his daughter. David had also murdered a man, so now somebody would murder his son. And that's what we are looking at in tonight's passage. We pick up the story in verse 21 of 2 Samuel 13, where we're told that David was extremely angry when he heard of what happened to Tamar. And he must have thought to himself how stupid he'd been himself that he'd sent Tamar to Amnon. For a very pretty girl was now ruined, and his son's soul had got a great blot on it. And what would the people of Israel think about the royal family now? David had cause to be angry, but was that enough? For there was no account of any punishment to Amnon, or even any rebuke. And Jewish history tells us that this was because Amnon was David's firstborn and therefore heir to the throne, and he didn't want to degrade him in the eyes of the people. But perhaps it may also have been the fact that David remembered his own guilt in this matter, and so he stopped short of telling Amnon off for what he himself had also done. But here's an important truth to bear in mind. For the question is, should parents tell their children off for doing something which they themselves have been guilty of? And the answer to that is yes. Parents are given an authority over their children, and they're responsible for guiding them through life. And it's wrong when children grow up and point to their parents' failings as a reason why they don't have to take any notice of their advice. It's the same with church ministers. If they can only rebuke people when their own life is perfect, they'd never point out anybody's failings, which they're called upon to do. Ministers should practice what they preach, but even if they don't, they should still preach it. David's refusal to punish Amnon for his evil deed only made Absalom all the more determined to take it into his own hands. He must have thought to himself, how can my father let such an atrocious crime go unpunished? That's just not right. That's just not fair. I've got my sister at home in complete misery, while Amnon gets off scot-free and prides himself that he got away with it. Well, if my father's not prepared to judge this matter as he ought, then I'll be the judge. But it's not so much justice that Absalom yearns for, but revenge. He cannot bring himself to speak to Amnon. We're told in verse 22 that for 2 years he never said anything to him. Remember that, 2 years never said anything to him, either good or bad, because he hated him so much for what he'd done to his sister. The New Testament says, whoso hated his brother is a murderer. And you can see that coming to pass here. In the sight of God, hatred is a form of murder, and those who do hate somebody are guilty of breaking the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill. Certainly the Christian should seek to be completely free of hatred. Notice how that one sin begets another one here. Amnon had started the hatred after he'd raped Tamar. Now Absalom hates him and seeks an occasion to murder him. Once people begin to do wrong, it starts a chain reaction of evil, and Absalom, he should have sought justice at the court of law, and sought some sort of restitution for his sister. And that wouldn't be wrong. But to murder a criminal so as to get your own back is wrong. People must not take the law into their own hands, no matter how frustrated they become or how badly they've been wronged. If the lawful authorities refuse to punish a criminal, then the Christian must take things to a higher authority and ask God to intervene. It's often been said that if you give things time, people's anger will cool down and they will get over it. But that wasn't the case with Absalom, was it? His sister's unhappiness kept what had happened fresh in his mind. There she was in front of him all the time, and he was more determined than ever to take Amnon's life. And as we saw before, revenge is a dish that's best served cold. Absalom was not a man of God. Indeed, we're told that his mother Maacah was the daughter of a heathen prince. So what we have here is the old problem of the believer marrying an unbeliever and their children growing up to be unbelievers themselves. And because of this, Absalom never dreamed of leaving the matter with God to sort out. He would take the matter into his own hands. He was a wealthy man, and he owned great flocks of sheep, and once a year he made a feast at this time of sheep shearing. And to this feast he invited the king, his father, and all the princes, his brothers. So as he saw it, this was his big opportunity both to pay respects to his family and also to show off to them how well he'd done and gain their esteem. And this sort of thing still goes on today, doesn't it? Families meeting each other for a party, and some of them are using the occasion to show off, to show others how well they've done for themselves. Absalom had little love for any of his brothers. His invitation was merely a cover-up for his wicked plan to assassinate Amnon. Just like Judas covered up his crime with a kiss, so Absalom covers up his crime with an invitation to a meal. They both acted slyly because what they did came from the serpent, the devil. When people are crafty and underhanded, you know that what they're doing cannot be the purpose of God. Although Absalom asked his father to come to the feast, he probably knew that David would decline the invitation. He certainly didn't want David to be there. And sure enough, David says no, he won't go. He says that he didn't want to cause Absalom all the expense that would be involved. And here David sets a good example to parents with grown-up children, that they should never want to be a financial burden to them. It may be different if the son or daughter becomes rich and the parents are still poor, but normally it's for parents to help their sons and daughters and not the other way round. But in order to take David's suspicions away, Absalom presses him to come. But still David says no. And then Absalom asks in verse 26 that David send Amnon to the feast. David seems to query this for a moment. Why do you want Amnon to go, he asks. But he doesn't get any answer. Perhaps David felt that Absalom wanted reconciliation between him and Amnon. He wanted to be good friends with him again. But nevertheless, at the back of his mind, there was a little doubt and a little worry. But against his better judgment, he's going to send Amnon and his other sons to the feast. As we saw last time, the sowing and reaping that God has inbuilt into human life is necessary for David himself to have a hand in the trouble that came to him. Just like he sent Uriah to Joab to his doom, so he'd sent Tamar to Amnon to her doom, and now he would send Amnon to Absalom for his doom. Now verse 28 tells us that Absalom gave orders to his servants that they should kill Amnon at the feast. They should keep their eyes on him all the time. He was eating and drinking. And when he became the worse for drink, Absalom would give the order to kill him. And this they should do without fear. Absalom probably knew that Amnon was a heavy drinker and would easily get drunk and then be less able to defend himself. In this matter, time hasn't changed over the years. Alcohol's always been a problem and still is, and it leads to the loss of many lives. Now, people usually seek to be with those men and women who are like them. And it's no coincidence that Absalom surrounded himself with servants who were just as evil as he was. They knew the commandment, thou shalt not kill, but they were prepared to blacken their souls for the sake of their master. And Absalom tells them to fear not. Don't fear any comeback upon you, either from man or from God. How true it is that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, and the lack of the fear of God leads to all sorts of crime. It's certainly the case that you can often sum up a person's character by looking at the sort of people they like being with. Worldly people choose to be with other worldly people. Backsliders tend to want to be with other backsliders. Christians who are going on with the Lord, keen Christians, want to meet with other keen Christians, and so on. How cowardly was Absalom's deed? Why didn't he have a duel with Ammon when they both had a clear mind? That would have been more honourable. But no, the deed must be done secretly by others when Amnon was befuddled in his mind. Anyway, the deed comes about. The rapist who thought he got away with his crime was happy eating and drinking when all of a sudden he was dispatched out of this world. He'd long before this congratulated himself on how he'd overcome Tamar and made her look like a fool. God had said that rapists should be put to death. That was the law, and it still is in some countries. But it was wrong how this rapist was put to death. However, once again, we have to see God's hand of retribution in all this. For David had deliberately planned to murder Uriah. That had been premeditated murder. So now it was with the murder of David's son. And David didn't kill Uriah himself. He got the Ammonites to do it. And so it was again with his son, for Absalom didn't murder Amnon himself, but he got his servants to do it. And David had murdered Uriah because of a beautiful girl. And so Absalom murders David's son also over a beautiful girl. And David had also made Uriah drunk, if you remember. That was part of his plot against him. So now his son is made to drink before he's slain. How can anybody deny these obvious tie-ups? Who can fail to accept that people will reap back what they sow? What honest person can fail to see the hand of God in what happens to people during their life? Notice how David lost out by his other failings as well. But if he had punished Amnon, as he should have done, he probably wouldn't have lost him. In fact, David eventually lost 2 sons through this, because this is where Absalom's rebellion started, which later led to his death. And yet there's another saying of reaping in all this, which is hidden away. For Absalom's mother had been a heathen princess from a Gentile city called Geshur, but God's people had been expressly forbidden to marry Gentiles at that time, and yet David had done so. And the 2 children that he had by her were both very good looking. Tamar, we saw last week, was very fair, and Absalom is described in the next chapter like this. There was none so much to be praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. And when he had cut his hair, it weighed 200 shekels. So it rather suggests that Absalom's mother, Maacah, was also good looking herself, which may have been why David married her. And probably when people saw David with Maacah and her lovely children in the early years of their marriage, they may have said to each other, what a lovely couple they are. They must have been made for each other. And David couldn't possibly have gone out of God's will in marrying her. And yet David finished up getting much sorrow out of these 2 children. And indeed their good looks were partly responsible for their downfall. For Absalom eventually got killed because of his long hair, and Tamar, as we've seen, was raped because of her beauty. Now verse 29 tells us that when Amnon was murdered, all the other sons of David became very frightened and fled away from that place on their mules. They feared for their lives, probably thinking that Absalom had killed their brother Amnon, who was heir to the throne, because he wanted to be heir to the throne himself. So maybe he would slay more of his brothers to that end. So the family reunion ended up as a family tragedy. Nathan had prophesied that a sword would be raised within David's family, and this has now come to pass. I expect there are family parties today, especially at Christmas, that end up with somebody getting hurt and with the relatives making a hasty retreat home, like David's sons did here, so that people who meet together with all smiles can finish up at loggerheads. Now, as David's sons were rushing home, news of what had happened went on before them, and it reached David before they did. The only thing was that the news somehow got twisted on the way, for the report said that Absalom had killed all David's sons, but there wasn't any of them left. It just shows you how careful must be when they're passing on information, for wrong information is worse than no information. Was it a genuine mistake that a person made, or did somebody deliberately exaggerate the truth so as to cause David misery? Was it a case of people who love sensational things happening, adding one thing to another? For a sinful heart is not beyond wallowing in the misery of other people. Why is it that New Testament tells us to weep with those who weep? You would think that was the natural thing to do, that when a person has heard of somebody else's trouble, they would feel sorry for them. But it's not always the case. Some people can be secretly happy when others are suffering, and poor David believed what he heard. He'd been told to expect bad news concerning his family, so he believed the worst. And for a while, he was the most miserable person in the whole world. He knew that he deserved punishment, but all of his sons being killed? Surely that was too much. Would God allow such a thing to happen? And so he tears his clothes and lies on the ground. Let us learn from this never to be devastated by bad news until it's been verified. Things may not be as bad as they seem. Many people worry about things when there's nothing to worry about. The young Saul was once worried about his father's lost asses when they weren't lost at all, they were safely at home. The Philippian jailer was at the point of killing himself because he thought that all his prisoners had escaped during the earthquake, but none of them had. At least half of the things that people worry about never happen. So when we hear the worst, let us hope for the best. And remember that we've got a great God who can always improve things for us, and he's called the God of all hope. In verse 32, Jonadab, who had previously advised Ammon to rape Tamar, now tells David that it's not all his sons that have been murdered, only one son, Amnon. And he further tells the king why Absalom had done it. It was by his appointment. In other words, this had been Absalom's plan all the time, ever since Amnon had raped his sister. But once again, Jonadab showed what a wicked person he was, because he could have told David about this before it had happened. Why didn't he tell David about this previously? Then it might have been prevented. David would certainly not have sent Amnon to Absalom if he'd had this information beforehand. The book of Proverbs says, "If thou forbear to deliver them that are drawn unto death, and those that are ready to be slain, if thou sayest, Behold, we knew it not, doth not he that pondereth the heart consider it? And he that keepeth thy soul, doth he not know it? And shall not he render to every man according to his works?" In other words, if you know of any mischief coming towards somebody and you don't warn them, then you'll be actually become an accessory to it. But the question is, why had Jonadab not warned Amnon himself about Absalom's plot? For back in verse 3, we're told that Jonadab and Amnon were friends. Could it be that during these 2 years, Amnon and Jonadab had fallen out with each other? Or could it be that Jonadab reckoned that if he told Amnon about Absalom's plan, Absalom might come and kill him? Or could it be that Jonadab was one of those wicked people who just loves seeing others getting hurt, and he's not a true friend to anybody? Certainly the lesson from this is that if you've got bad friends, and accept their bad advice, in the end those bad friends will be bad to you. Ungodly friends will lead people into sin, but they won't be at hand to help you. I often think about motorists, cars going along and people hoot because you're not going fast enough for them, and yet they're not going to be there if you have a crash. You've got to drive yourself and forget about them. You can see how evil Jonadab was by his advice to David in verse 33. He says, "Don't take this business too much to heart, for only one of your sons is dead." As if that didn't matter. You've got the other children, so it doesn't matter too much if one of them had been murdered. Now, whether David believed Jonadab's words that only one of his sons had been murdered, we don't know. But soon afterwards, the other sons are seen returning home. They were first seen by a young man who kept the watch on guard duty. And then Jonadab stated that it was the king's sons returning, so that David need not be so devastated. When they arrived, they told David what had happened to Amnon. And although David could see that all his other sons were all right, he's still very grieved about what had happened to Amnon. It says that the whole royal family lifted up their voice and wept very sore. Once again, we're seeing all the time it's being repeated that David's one act of adultery with Bathsheba was paying its heavy wages. And Satan is still tempting God's people to do wrong, but he never wants them to think about the grief that's going to come back on them as a result. Now, in the meantime, verse 37 tells us that Absalom runs away, fearing that David and his sons might come after him and kill him. And he went, as we might expect, to his mother's relatives, and they showed him hospitality. It was his grandfather, the king of Geshur. Absalom was a heathen man at heart, so he goes with his heathen relatives. He'd been brought up and he's swayed more by his mother's side than his father's side, which sadly suggests that when a Christian is married to a non-Christian, there's more chance of the children growing up in the way of the unbelieving parent, because it's an easier of the two ways to go. Absalom stayed in Geshur for 3 years, but it's a pity that he didn't stay there for the rest of his life, as that would have prevented the civil war that came about later, and indeed would have preserved Absalom's own life. We're told at the end of verse 37 that David mourned over Amnon every day, because even if your son was a rapist, you'd still grieve over his death. Anyway, a certain amount of time went by, and eventually David got over the death of his son, and then he starts feeling sorry for his other son, Absalom. In fact, we're told in the last verse that he longed to go and see him. You see, time is a great healer, and gradually David came to be more concerned with the living than with the dead. But once again, David made no attempt to punish his son, which was another sin which he was also to later reap back. Of all his sons, David seems to have had a special love for Absalom, and it was seen in the way he favoured him. But although David pined after Absalom, nothing is said about Absalom pining after him. You see, the ungodly have little natural affection, and grown-up children will rarely have the same love and concern for their parents as the parents do for them. What a very sad chapter this has been. You have to feel very sorry for the young girl Tamar, but as far as the men in this chapter are concerned, they're all villains, aren't they? Amnon, the rapist, Absalom, the murderer, Jonadab, the evil friend, and David himself, failing to control or chasten his sons, and obviously reaping back what he'd sown. Let us learn from this chapter to keep away from evil ourselves and to do all we can to resist temptation, not only because it means sinning against God, but also because it may bring trouble to us and our families. Who can read through this chapter and not be aware of their own failures and shortcomings? how essential it is for us to repent of our sin and to come to the cross of Christ and to make sure that Jesus is our Saviour and friend. May he be praised. Amen.